All right, this is my first attempt at doing something like this, so I hope it works. This is Chapter 10, A Democratic Revolution from 1800 to 1844. One thing to keep in mind as you are listening and following along is the identifying the big idea question. What were the main features of the Democratic Revolution, and what role did Andrew Jackson play in its outcome? Some of the things that are going to be referenced in Chapter 10 is Section 1, the rise of popular politics from 1810 to 1828. We'll look at the decline of the notables and the rise of parties, the election of 1824, the last notable president, John Quincy Adams, and the democracy and the election of 1828. We'll transition into the next section, which is the Jacksonian presidency from 1829 to 1837. We'll take a look at Jackson's agenda, rotation and decentralization, the tariff and nullification, the bank war, Indian removal, and the Jacksonian impact. Finally, Section 3 is entitled Class Culture in the Second Party System. We'll look at the Whig worldview, labor politics in the Depression of 1837 through 1843, and Tippecanoe and Tyler too. All right, here we go. Europeans who visited the United States in the 1830s mostly praised its Republican society, but not its political parties and politicians. The gentleman spit, talk of elections and the price of produce, and spit again, Francis Trollope reported in Domestic Manners of the Americans in 1832. In her view, American politics was the sport of self-serving party politicians who reeked of whiskey and onions. Other Europeans lamented the low intellectual level of American political debate, the claptrap of praise and pathos by a Massachusetts politician deeply disgusted Harriet Martineau, while the shallow arguments advanced by the inept farmers, shopkeepers, and country lawyers who sat in the New York Assembly astonished Basil Hall. The negative verdict was nearly unanimous. The most able men in the United States are very rarely placed at the head of affairs, French aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville concluded in Democracy in America in 1835. The reason, said Tocqueville, lay in the character of democracy itself. Most citizens ignored important policy issues. Jealousy refused to elect their intellectual superiors and listened in awe to the clamor of a montbank, a charismatic fraud, who knows the secret of stimulating their tastes. These Europeans were witnessing the American Democratic Revolution. Before 1815, men of ability had sat in the seats of government, and the prevailing ideology had been republicanism, or rule by men of talents and virtue, as a newspaper put it. Many of those leaders feared popular rule, so they wrote constitutions with bills of rights and bicameral legislatures and independent judiciaries, and they censured overambitious men who campaigned for public office. But history took a different course. By the 1820s and 1830s, the watchwords were democracy and party politics, a system run by men who avidly sought office and rallied supporters through newspapers, broadsides, and great public processions. Politics became a sport, a competitive contest for the votes of ordinary men. That the majority should govern was a fundamental maxim in all free governments, declared Martin Van Buren, the most talented of the new breed of professional politicians. A Republican-minded Virginian condemned Van Buren as too great an intrigue, but by encouraging ordinary Americans to burn with election fever and support party principles, he and other politicians redefined the meaning of democratic government and made work of it. The rise of popular politics from 1810 to 1828. Expansion of the franchise, meaning the right to vote, dramatically symbolized the Democratic Revolution. By the 1830s, most states allowed nearly all white men to vote. Nowhere else in the world did ordinary farmers and wage earners exercise such political influence. In England, the Reform Bill of 1832 extended the vote to only 600,000 out of 6 million men, a mere 10%. Equally important, political parties provided voters with the means to express their preferences. The decline of notables and the rise of parties. The American Revolution weakened the elite-run society of the colonial era, but did not overthrow it. Only 2 states, Pennsylvania and Vermont, gave the vote to all male taxpayers, and many families of low rank continued to defer to their social betters. Consequently, wealthy notables, meaning northern landowners, northern landlords, slave-owning planters, and seaport merchants dominated the political system in the new republic. And rightly so, said John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Those who own the country are the most fit persons to participate in the government of it. Jay and other notables managed local elections by building up an interest, lending money to small farmers, giving business to storekeepers, and treating their tenants to rum. An outlay of $20 for refreshments, remarked one poll watcher, may produce about 100 votes. This gentry-dominated system kept men who lacked wealth and powerful family connections from seeking office. The rise of democracy. To expand the suffrage, Maryland reformers in the 1810s invoked the equal rights rhetoric of republicanism. They charged that property qualifications for voting were a tyranny because they endowed one class of men with privileges which are denied to another. To diffuse such arguments and deter migration to the West, legislators in Maryland and other seaboard states grudgingly accepted a broader franchise and its democratic results. The new voters often rejected candidates who wore top boots, breeches, and shoe buckles, their hair in powder and queues. Instead, they elected men who dressed simply and endorsed popular rule. Smallholding farmers and ambitious laborers in the Midwest and Southwest likewise challenged the old hierarchical order. In Ohio, a traveler reported, "No white man or woman will bear being called a servant." The constitutions of the new states in Indiana, admitted in 1816, Illinois in 1818, and Alabama in 1819, prescribed a broad male franchise, and voters usually elected middling men to local and state offices. A well-to-do migrant in Illinois was surprised to learn that the man who plowed his fields was a colonel of militia and a member of the legislature. Once in public office, men from modest backgrounds restricted imprisonment for debt, kept taxes low, and allowed farmers to claim squatters' rights to unoccupied lands. By the mid-1820s, many state legislators had given the vote to all white men or to all men who paid taxes or served in the militia. Only a few, North Carolina, Virginia, and Rhode Island, still required the possession of freehold property. Equally significant, between 1818 and 1821, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York wrote more democratic constitutions that reapportioned legislative districts on the basis of population and mandated the popular election, rather than appointment of judges and justices of the peace. Democratic politics was contentious and, because it attracted ambitious men, often corrupt. And speculators, both notables and self-made men, demanded government assistance and paid bribes to get it. Speculators won land grants by paying off the members of important committees, and bankers distributed shares of stock to key legislators. The Bank of New York City received a legislative charter in 1833. The bank's officials set aside 1/3 of the 3,700 shares of stock for themselves and their friends, and almost 2/3 for state legislators and bureaucrats, leaving just 40 shares for public sale. More political disputes broke out when religious reformers sought laws to enforce the cultural agenda of the benevolent empire. In Utica, New York, evangelical Presbyterians insisted upon a town ordinance restricting Sunday entertainment. In response, a member of the local Universalist Church, a free-thinking Protestant denomination, denounced the measure as coercive and called for religious liberty. Parties take command. The appearance of political parties encouraged such debates over government policy. Revolutionary-era Americans had condemned political factions as anti-republican, and the new state and national constitutions made no mention of political parties. However, as the power of notables waned in the 1820s, disciplined political parties appeared in a number of states. Usually they were run by professional politicians, often middle-class lawyers and journalists. One observer called the new parties political machines because, like a new power-driven textile loom, they efficiently wove together the interests of diverse social and economic groups. Martin Van Buren of New York was the chief architect of the emerging system of party government. The ambitious son of a Jeffersonian tavern keeper, Van Buren grew up in the landlord-dominated society of the Hudson River Valley. To get training as a lawyer, he relied on the Van Ness clan, a powerful local gentry family. Then, determined not to become their dependent tool, Van Buren repudiated their tutelage and set out to create a political order based on party identity, not family connections. In justifying party governments, Van Buren rejected the traditional Republican belief that political factions were dangerous and claimed that the opposite was true. All men of sense know that political parties are inseparable from free government because they checked an elected official's inherent disposition to abuse of power. Between 1817 and 1821 in New York, Van Buren turned his bucktail supporters, who wore a deer's tail on their hats, into the first statewide political machine. He purchased a newspaper, the Albany Argus, and used it to promote his policies and get out the vote. Patronage was an even more important tool. When Van Buren's bucktails won control of the New York legislature in 1821, they acquired the power to appoint some 6,000 of their friends to positions in New York's legal bureaucracy of judges, justices of the peace, sheriffs, deed commissioners, and coroners. Critics called this ruthless distribution of offices a spoil system, but Van Buren argued it was fair, operating sometimes in favor of one party and sometimes of another. Party government was thoroughly Republican, he added, because it reflected the preferences of a majority of the citizenry. To ensure the passage of the party's legislative program, Van Buren insisted on disciplined voting as determined by a caucus, a meeting of party leaders. On one crucial occasion, the Little Magician, a nickname reflecting Van Buren's short stature and political dexterity, honored 17 New York legislators for sacrificing individual preferences for the general good of the party. On page 317 is America Compared, Alexis de Tocqueville in his letter to Louis de Kergolay on June 29, 1831. In 1831, the French aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States to report on its innovative penal system. Instead, he produced a brilliant analysis of the new Republican society and politics. Democracy in America is the title of the book. This letter to a French friend reveals his thinking and insights. Do you know what is in this country's political realm makes the most vivid impression on me? The effect of laws governing inheritance. The English had exported their laws of primogeniture, according to which the eldest acquired 3/4 of the father's fortune. This resulted in a host of vast territorial domains passing from father to son and wealth remaining in families. My American informants tell me that there was no aristocracy, but instead a class of great landowners leading a simple, rather intellectual life characterized by its air of good breeding, its manners, and a strong sense of family pride. Since then, inheritance laws have been revised. Primogeniture gave way to equal division, with almost magical results. Domains split up, passing into other hands. Family spirit disappeared. The aristocratic bias that marked the Republic's early years was replaced by a democratic thrust of irresistible force. I've seen several members of these old families. They regret the loss of everything aristocratic: patronage, family pride, high tone. There can be no doubt that the inheritance law is responsible in some considerable measure for this complete triumph of democratic principles. The Americans agree that it has made us what we are. It is the foundation of our republic. When I apply these ideas to France, I cannot resist the thought that Louis XVIII's Charter of 1814 sought to restore the pre-revolutionary regime by creating aristocratic institutions and political law, but by mandating equality before the law and retaining the Revolutionary era inheritance laws giving all children, irrespective of sex, an equal share of the parental estate within the domain of civil law gave shelter to a democratic principle so vigorous that it was bound before long to destroy the foundations of the edifice it raised. We are moving toward an unrestricted democracy. That would not suit France at all. However, there is no human power capable of changing the law of inheritance, and with this change, our families will disappear. Possessions will pass into other hands, wealth will be increasingly equalized, the upper class will melt into the middle, the latter will become immense and shape everything to its level. What I see in America leaves me doubting that government by the multitude, even under the most favorable circumstances, and they exist here, is a good thing. There is general agreement that in the early days of the Republic, statesmen and members of the two legislative houses were much more distinguished than they are today. They almost all belong to that class of landowners I mentioned above. The populace no longer chooses with such a sure hand. It generally favors those who flatter its passions and descend to its level. So, two questions to consider for analysis in regards to this primary document. Number one, according to Tocqueville, what is the legal basis of American social equality and political democracy? What is the comparable situation in France? And number two, why does Tocqueville doubt that democratic rule is a good thing even in the United States and would not suit France at all? The election of 1824. The advance of political democracy in the states undermined the traditional notable dominated system of national politics. After the War of 1812, the aristocratic Federalist Party virtually disappeared, and the Republican Party splintered into competing factions, as referenced in Chapter 7. As the election of 1824 approached, 5 Republican candidates campaigned for the presidency. 3 were veterans of President James Monroe's cabinet: Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, the son of former President John Adams, Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, and Secretary of the Treasury William H. Crawford. The other candidates were Henry Clay of Kentucky, the hard-drinking, dynamic Speaker of the House of Representatives, and General Andrew Jackson, now a senator from Tennessee. When the Republican caucus in Congress selected Crawford as the party's official nominee, the other candidates took their case to the voters. Thanks to Democratic reforms, 18 of the 24 states required popular elections rather than a vote of the state's legislature to choose their representatives to the Electoral College. Each candidate had strengths. Thanks to his diplomatic success as Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams enjoyed national recognition, and his family's prestige in Massachusetts ensured him the electoral votes of New England. Henry Clay based his candidacy on the American system, his integrated mercantilist program of national economic development similar to the Commonwealth system of the state governments. Clay wanted to strengthen the Second Bank of the United States, raise tariffs, and use tariff revenues to finance internal improvements, that is, public works such as roads and canals. His nationalistic program won praise in the West, which needed better transportation, but elicited sharp criticism in the South, which relied on rivers to market its cotton and had few manufacturing industries to protect. William Crawford of Georgia, an ideological heir of Thomas Jefferson, denounced Clay's American system as a scheme to consolidate political power in Washington. Recognizing Crawford's appeal in the South, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina withdrew from the race and endorsed Andrew Jackson. As the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson benefited from the surge of patriotism after the War of 1812. Born in the Carolina backcountry, Jackson settled in Nashville, Tennessee, where he formed ties to influential families through marriage and a career as an attorney and a slave-owning cotton planter. His rise from common origin symbolized the new democratic age, and his reputation as a plain, solid Republican attracted voters in all regions. Still, Jackson's strong showing in the Electoral College surprised most political leaders. The Tennessee senator received 99 electoral votes. Adams garnered 84 votes. Crawford, struck down by a stroke during the campaign, won 41, and Clay finished with 37. And you can see that represented on map 10.1 on page 319. Because no candidate received an absolute majority, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in 1804, set the rules. The House of Representatives would choose the president from among the 3 highest vote getters. This procedure hurt Jackson because many congressmen feared that the rough-hewn military chieftain might become a tyrant. Excluded from the race, Henry Clay used his influence as Speaker to thwart Jackson's election. Clay assembled a coalition of representatives from New England and the Ohio River Valley that voted Adams into the presidency in 1825. Adams showed his gratitude by appointing Clay his Secretary of State, the traditional stepping stone to the presidency. Clay's appointment was politically fatal for both men. Jackson supporters accused Clay and Adams of making a corrupt bargain, a vocabulary term you need to know, and they vowed to oppose Adams' policies and to prevent Clay's rise to the presidency. The last notable president, John Quincy Adams. As president, Adams called for bold national action. Quote, "The moral purpose of the Creator," end quote, he told Congress, was to use the president to, quote, "improve the conditions of himself and his fellow men," end quote. Adams called for the establishment of a national university in Washington, scientific explorations in the far west, and a uniform standard of weights and measures. Most important, he endorsed Henry Clay's American system and its three key elements: protective tariffs to stimulate manufacturing, federally subsidized roads and canals to facilitate commerce, and a national bank to control credit and provide a uniform currency. The fate of Adams' policies. Manufacturers, entrepreneurs, and farmers in the Northeast and Midwest welcomed Adams' proposals. However, his policies won little support in the South, where planters opposed protective tariffs because these taxes raised the price of manufacturers. Southern smallholders also feared powerful banks that could force them into bankruptcy. From his deathbed, Thomas Jefferson condemned Adams for promoting a single and splendid government of moneyed aristocracy, riding and ruling over the plundered plowmen and beggared yeomanry. Other politicians objected to the American system on constitutional grounds. In 1817, President Madison had vetoed the Bonus Bill, which proposed using the national government's income from the Second Bank of the United States to fund improvement projects in the states. Such projects, Madison argued, were the sole responsibility of the states, a sentiment shared by the Republican followers of Thomas Jefferson. In 1824, Martin Van Buren likewise declared his allegiance to the constitutional doctrines of the Jefferson School and his opposition to consolidated government. Another vocab term you need to know. A powerful and potentially oppressive national administration. Now a member of the United States Senate, Van Buren helped to defeat most of Adams' proposed subsidies for roads and canals. The tariff battle. The major battle of the Adams administration came over tariffs. The tariff of 1816 had placed relatively high duties on imports of cheap English cotton cloth, allowing New England textile producers to control that segment of the market. In 1824, Adams and Clay secured a new tariff that protected New England and Pennsylvania manufacturers from more expensive woolen and cotton textiles and also English iron goods. Without these tariffs, British imports would have dominated the market and significantly inhibited American industrial development. Recognizing the appeal of tariffs, Van Buren and his Jacksonian allies hopped on the bandwagon. By increasing duties on wool, hemp, and other imported raw materials, they hoped to win the support of farmers in New York, Ohio, and Kentucky for Jackson's presidential candidacy in 1828. The tariff had become a political weapon. Quote, "I fear this tariff thing," end quote, remarked Thomas Cooper, the former president of the College of South Carolina and an advocate of free trade. Quote, "By some strange mechanical contrivance, it has become a machine for manufacturing presidents instead of broadcloths and bed blankets," end quote. Disregarding Southern protests, Northern Jacksonians joined with supporters of Adams and Clay to enact the Tariff of 1828, which raised duties significantly on raw materials, textiles, and iron goods. The new tariff enraged the South, which produced the world's cheapest raw cotton and did not need to protect its main industry. Moreover, the tariff cost Southern planters about $100 million a year. Planters had to buy either higher-cost American textiles and iron goods, thus enriching Northeastern businesses and workers, or highly dutied British imports, thus paying the expenses of the national government. The new tariff was little less than legalized pillage, an Alabama legislator declared, calling it a tariff of abominations. The tariff of abominations is another vocabulary term that you need to know. Ignoring the Jacksonian support for the Tariff of 1828, most Southerners heaped blame on President Adams. Southern governments also criticized Adams' Indian policy. A deeply moral man, the president supported the treaty-guaranteed land rights of Native Americans against expansion-minded whites. In 1825, U.S. commissioners had secured a treaty from one faction of Creeks ceding its lands in Georgia to the United States for eventual sale to the state's citizens. When the Creek Nation Council repudiated the treaty, claiming that it was fraudulent, Adams called for new negotiations. In response, Georgia Governor George M. Troup attacked the president as a public enemy, the unblushing ally of the savages. Mobilizing Georgia's congressional delegation, Troup persuaded Congress to extinguish the Creek's land titles, forcing most Creeks to leave the state. Elsewhere, Adams' primary weakness was his out-of-date political style. The last notable to serve in the White House, he acted the part: aloof, inflexible, and paternalistic. When Congress rejected his activist economic policies, Adams accused its members of following the whims of public opinion and told them not to be enfeebled by the will of our constituents. Ignoring his waning popularity, the president refused to dismiss hostile federal bureaucrats or to award offices to his supporters. Rather than run for re-election in 1828, Adams stood for it, telling friends, quote, "If my country wants my services, she must ask for them," end quote. The Democracy and the Election of 1828. Martin Van Buren and the politicians handling Andrew Jackson's campaign for the presidency had no reservations about running for office. To put Jackson in the White House, Van Buren revived the political coalition created by Thomas Jefferson, championing policies that appealed to both Southern planters and Northern farmers and artisans. The Plain Republicans of the North. John C. Calhoun, Jackson's running mate, brought his South Carolina allies into Van Buren's party, and Jackson's close friends in Tennessee rallied voters throughout the Old Southwest. The little magician hoped that a national party would reconcile the diverse interests that, as James Madison suggested in Federalist Number 10, inevitably existed in a large republic. Equally important, added Jackson's ally Duff Green, it would put the anti-slave party in the North to sleep for 20 years to come. At Van Buren's direction, the Jacksonians orchestrated a massive publicity campaign. In New York, 50 Democrat-funded newspapers declared their support for Jackson. Elsewhere, Jacksonians used mass meetings, torchlight parades, and barbecues to celebrate the candidate's frontier origin and his rise to fame. They praised Old Hickory as a natural aristocrat, a self-made man. The Jacksonians called themselves Democrats or the Democracy to convey their egalitarian message. As Thomas Morris told the Ohio legislature, Democrats were fighting for equality. The Republic had been corrupted by legislative charters that gave a few individuals rights and privileges not enjoyed by the citizens at large. Morris promised that the Democracy would destroy such artificial distinction. Jackson himself declared that equality among the people in the rights conferred by government was the great radical principle of freedom. Jackson's message appealed to many social groups. His hostility to corporations and to Clay's American system won support from Northeastern artisans and workers who felt threatened by industrialization. Jackson also captured the voters of Pennsylvania ironworkers and New York farmers who had benefited from the controversial Tariff of Abominations. Yet, by astutely declaring his support for a judicious tariff that would balance regional interests, Jackson remained popular in the South. Old Hickory likewise garnered votes in the Southeast and Midwest, where his well-known hostility toward Native Americans reassured white farmers seeking Indian removal. The Democrats' celebration of popular rule carried Jackson into office. In 1824, about 1/4 of the electorate had voted. In 1828, more than 1/2 went to the polls, and 56% voted for the Tennessee senator. The first president from a trans-Appalachian state, Jackson cut a dignified figure as he traveled to Washington. He wore his hair carelessly, but not ungracefully arranged, an English observer noted, and in spite of his harsh, gaunt features, looked like a gentleman and a soldier. Still, Jackson's popularity and sharp temper frightened men of wealth. Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, a former Federalist and now a corporate lawyer, warned his clients that the new president would bring a breeze with him. Which way will it blow? I cannot tell, but my fear is stronger than my hope. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story shared Webster's apprehensions. Watching an unruly Inauguration Day crowd climb over the elegant White House furniture to congratulate Jackson, Story lamented that the reign of King Mob seemed triumphant. I'm going to stop there. That's the end of section 1. I want to check to make sure that this actually recorded.